relate to things that we covered not today, but last week and the prior week, which is pretty much only the Coastal Act. I mean, pretty much. Maybe a couple of, somewhat minor deviations from that, but mostly the Coastal Act. And I don't know, I guess you might be able to say that remember how I drew that stupid map and we did that? Okay, it wasn't stupid. I drew that map and we did this class exercise on Peninsula Bay. This is kind of maybe an easy way to think about doing a review, maybe. Because this map includes really most of the stuff we talked about, right? When it came to coastal development. I think this map does a pretty good job of summarizing a lot of those things. For example, who remembers in this map, we've got all these houses that are built on the south side. We got a big hotel and a golf course. We got a vacant lot. What does the California Coastal Act say that this owner of the lot must do in order to build his condominiums? Yeah, must.
Include a right, but...
Okay, well, let's not get there yet. You're way ahead of me, Marcy.
Permit?
Get a permit! So, development, again, there's this word, development means like any physical change, right? Any physical change is development, quote, and there has to be a CCC permit. Now, going back to what you were just saying about access. So, if somebody, like hypothetically, if this owner buys this property, they want to build condos, and they block off this path, what do they need to do? They block the path.
They have to add a new path. It's a form of vertical.
You're ahead of me, but
Okay.
before that, yeah,
They need a permit.
they still need a permit. So not just any physical change in either the environment or a change in access. They have to get a California Coastal Act permit. So for the California Coastal Act, this is like the key most important thing, is that development permits are required for physical changes. Either in access or building things or... Now, what did we say were the reasons for having a Coastal Act? Like, what are like some of the policy reasons we talked about why California, we're like, we really need a Coastal Act. Why? What were some, yeah.
Was it the Santa Barbara oil spill of 1960?
So one group of reasons why we wanted to have a Coastal Act is we wanted to protect our coast. Preserve our coastal resources for enjoyment and tourism and fishing and using the beaches. We wanted to protect and preserve our coast. It was one of the main reasons. What's another reason that California voters wanted a Coastal Act? What were we worried about after World War II? I was describing to you how things changed in California really fast. We started with Long Beach Harbor being a one-horse town. Yeah, Miles.
So the coast all being privately owned?
So that's one thing, but when you say privately owned, what does that mean? What did people do?
They made it inaccessible to the public.
Yes, so they bought property, and then what did they do?
Developed.
They developed it, and while they were developing it, what did they do? They built fences and, so the coast got developed really fast. So we wanted to have an orderly process to control development, an orderly process so that the development that happened wasn't chaotic. It was planned, it was thought out. And that's what the permit process is supposed to give you. If you have to go through a permit process, there's this vetting that takes place. Everybody know that word vetting? Vetting means when you're overseeing something to make sure that it's done fairly, that it's done properly, that it's done in a way that doesn't cause harm. So, protect and preserve, an orderly process to develop our shoreline led to what Miles was saying, lack of access. Lack of public access So what does the Coastal Act basically require on this map? We talked about two kinds of access.
Vertical access.
One is vertical, gotta be vertical access. So on this map, we talked about how the problem is, one of the problems, there's nowhere for the public to park their car on PCH and get to the beach, unless they're crossing somewhat illegally over this informal pathway to get down to these tide pools. And then once they're at these tide pools, what other kind of access could they use to move around? Horizontal. So the other kind, there has to be vertical and horizontal freedom of movement. So I would say the Coastal Act requires these things. It requires protecting and preserving valuable resources, an orderly process to develop using permits. It requires access, vertical and horizontal. What else did we talk about with this map? Do you remember anything else? Talked about vertical access, horizontal access. We should probably talk about these seawalls. Because, that might be something I put on the quiz. Seawalls. So, in this map, these people have already built their seawall. But just for fun, let's pretend that they haven't built their seawall, that they want to build one. And so, that's development, right? They're going to need a permit to build their seawall. But to get their permit, does anybody remember any of the rules that control whether they're entitled to get a seawall permit?
Technically, it says that it has to be only for an existing structure.
Yes. So, must if it's existing structure. And then may be entitled if it wasn't. If it wasn't existing, then the Coastal Commission may give one. But they must give one if it's existing. But remember the controversy about remember the year about the controversy with whether something is existing? Everybody remember what year that was?
1972.
Close. So when was the Coastal Act finalized? Anybody remember that? 76. And 77, exactly, is the year that is, I'm losing this pen, I gotta find another one. is the year that's listed in the statute as being the key year for whether or not a seawall is allowed is 1977. That's, that one doesn't work. Try this one. So if it was existing before 1977, then it's must have to give them a seawall permit. But if they built it after 1977, and these guys, of course, if this were now, obviously it's after 1977. So the Coastal Commission would have discretion. They could say, oh yeah, we feel sorry for you guys. We'll give you a permit. Or they could say, no, you don't get a permit. Because to give you a permit for a seawall would further block public access vertically from the highway to the beach. And what's the other problem with seawalls? For environments, yeah.
It kills the beach itself.
It eventually erodes and destroys the beach. So because we know beaches get eroded and destroyed by seawalls, if these people got their permit to build their seawall, what would they have to do? Do you remember what would they have to do if they got their permit?
Either contribute to rebuilding the beach or something else. I don't remember the other part.
So if they get it, they have to do mitigation. That's the word. The term of art is mitigation, which means they either have to keep that beach nourished and alive, or they have to pay money. Well, they're called mitigation fees, assuming they get their permit. But again, because now is clearly after 1977, the Coastal Commission's position is that we have discretion to approve or deny a seawall. That's their position. Will they win on that in court? I think I was telling you about a current case that's moving its way through the courts up in Santa Cruz County, up in Half Moon Bay, where the judge has initially said that the word existing applies for all time, which makes no sense. But that's what the judge said, yeah.
And they still allow for seawalling even though it accelerates erosion and makes it harder to
They can.
access the beaches?
They can.
Okay.
Now, they normally won't. Normally. But there are some situations in which they'll still grant seawall permits if a place is in imminent danger of harm to public safety. You know what I mean? Like, if there's train tracks or roads or things where people could get hurt,
The Seaside Hospital.
or schools or something, you know, they're probably gonna give a permit in that case. But if it's somebody that just has their giant McMansion and they're worried about the future of flooding in their parlor smoking room or whatever it is, the Coastal Commission, you know, say, sorry, the way we read the Coastal Act is that we're only required to give you a permit if your house existed as of 1977. Some really interesting wrinkles in this is like, what if the house existed in 1977 as this little tiny cottage, but then somebody knocked it down and it was vacant for like 5 years, then they rebuilt it into a mansion, you know, then that gets interesting, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, is it like the zoning or the structure?
Yeah, so, you know, it's really quite unclear, and usually what people say is if the same owners owned it, then they can change the structure if they want to. It still counts. They're grandfathered back to, you know, 1970 or when they had their original beach cottage. Yeah.
So if they change ownership, then you can't do it?
Changing ownership? And if you bought it at the time that it was knocked down and vacant, but if you bought it at a time that it was fully constructed, I mean, these are the wrinkles that are not clear.
It's like if there's a structure, like a little tiny shack, like you said,
Yeah.
someone bought it in like 1990, so like way after, and they left the shack but also built a McMansion. Like,
I think if the McMansion was constructed, you know, really recently, and then they came back and asked for a seawall, and at the time they bought the property, it was undeveloped, like the shack was gone, and it had been gone for a long time.
Yeah.
The 1977 requirement rule might not stick. Yeah.
Are the mitigation fees, is that one time or is that like recurring?
One time.
Okay.
Yeah. I imagine they could probably structure mitigation fees, like they have some like flexibility to negotiate with property owners about how they do the mitigation. But in general, like that Monterey Bay case that we talked about where I had the slide of that seawall in Monterey, they had to pay that $5 million all at once. And once they paid the $5 million, they'd wash their hands of it and their wall would gradually erode the beach. Yeah.
Is the mitigation for any permit, or does it have to be, or is it just the before after 1977, or is that just?
Yeah, any seawall that's allowed nowadays has to do mitigation. So it doesn't matter if the property was built in the 1940s, it doesn't matter if it was built in the 1990s. If you build a wall pursuant to a permit, gotta do mitigation.
do you know how they decide like the amount? Is it like the size of the wall? Or?
I don't understand it. It's an economic speak.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, they sort of think about how much are beaches worth,
Yeah.
and what's the square cubic yard of sand that they predict will be lost,
Oh, okay.
and then they calculate the fee that had to be paid based on
Square footage.
kind of like what the value of that
Yeah.
square footage of sand is worth, and that might vary from community to community. Like,
a tourist
if that sand was in La Jolla at San Diego, or if it was like in Newport, that sand in mitigation might be worth more than sand somewhere up in, you know, I don't know, northern or central California. I don't know. Yeah. So, yeah, these are problems with seawalls, right? And remember how we talked about how seawalls are basically the least favored by government for sure. Property owners want them because they want to extend the life of their, coastal property as long as they can. But there's some alternatives, right? What's an alternative to building a seawall that might work, that we talked about? So seawalls are one, we call this whole area that Dave talked about in class, sea level rise, SLR. So walls are one thing. What's another thing that we can do? Well, groins are a type of wall, basically. I mean, armoring, a type of armor. Yeah.
Setbacks?
Setbacks. So we could require science-based setbacks. Building codes, science-based setbacks. What else can we do?
Riprap,
What's that?
like the big rocks.
Still walls.
Okay.
When they talk about seawalls, they're talking about really generally
Okay.
any kind of hard structure that's put.
Okay.
So that's probably still a wall.
Beach nourishment.
So restoration or nourishment, you could use whatever word you want. Nourishment, restoration. So you're building back a natural beach. Everybody likes this as long as somebody else pays for it, because it's really expensive to engineer and to do sand restoration and nourishment. And it's temporary, right? It's probably going to work for 5 years, 10 years. Eventually it's going to wash away, and then you have to do it again. So again, the problem is always who's going to pay for that. What's another one? Any others? There was one other. Starts with an R.
Restoration.
Retreat. So Ryan, retreat. The key thing about retreat is they're going to have to move their building. They're going to have to move it backwards. But they only have to move it backwards. Does anybody remember? They have to move it backwards only in the event that what happens? That what happens to it? Yeah.
2/3 of the property would have to be rebuilt.
So if it's damaged or destroyed by a 2/3 ratio, that's the rebuild, then retreat is required. There's very few communities that have a retreat policy, but I predict that this policy is coming in the future, more places, where if somebody's coastal McMansion is 2/3 wiped away in a big storm, then under retreat policies, they're just gonna have to rebuild it backwards, away from, the predicted, it's all about the mean high water mark, right? I mean, it's always been all about the mean, yeah.
So what's the policy then when only 1/3 of it is destroyed?
It's great. That's where this other concept called grandfathering. If it's or sometimes this is called. It starts with an R too. Does anybody remember? I said rolling retreat. So rolling retreat is where it's 1/3 destroyed, 1/3, 1/4, 1/2. Then rolling retreat means they can keep rebuilding it. Rolling retreat, grandfathering it. It rolls with the damage until it has to be red tagged because you can't live in it. It's not safe to live in it. And that's when the retreat would kick in, probably. So, that's kind of most of what we talked about the last 2 weeks, right? Can anybody think of anything else we talked about last couple of weeks? Development permits, sea level rise responses. Let me look at my notes real quick, see if I can think of anything else. Say again?
Like regulatory taking.
Oh yeah, that's a disgusting legalistic one.
Yeah.
What's a taking? Who remembers what a taking is? What does the government do?
Just take your land pretty much without paying. Right? Take it without paying.
It's a little bit different with property that is above the high tide line. Because the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution says the federal government cannot take your property without paying just compensation. So they do have to pay money compensation for inland properties that are taken away. They don't have to do that if it's in the tidal zone, because that's navigation zone too. If it's in the tidal zone, they don't have to pay you. But if it's above the tidal zone, then they do. So a physical taking is when the government shows up and they kick you off and occupy your land. That's where they physically do that. They almost never do that, but then they have to pay you fair market value for it. What we talked about that's maybe harder is this idea of a regulatory taking, where you'll have, so in a reg taking, I call it a reg taking. Reg taking, you'll have Enviro, it stands for environmental, Enviro rules that basically prevent all develop, or some or most, I don't know. Let's just say they prevent development, that's easier. They prevent development. So what the property owners, like Mr. Lucas famously said in South Carolina, he said, look, I can't build my house because of these coastal sand dune protection rules. So it's basically the same as if the government has occupied my land. It's basically the same thing. And he wins with that argument. And the Supreme Court says that if the money value of the property goes so far down that it's almost $0, then that's a regulatory taking. You know, I would make the argument if I were the attorney representing the state that coastal property is never worth nothing. Even if you can't build a 2-story house on it, like Mr. Lucas who wanted to build a 2-story house. I mean, I know people in Santa Barbara at Hollister Ranch, the famous place we talked about a few weeks ago, Hollister Ranch, where they pay $400,000 just to be able to access Hollister Ranch. No structure, just to get in there for the rest of their lives. So is coastal property ever worthless in California? I would argue never, but I might lose with that argument. Yeah.
Couldn't they just say if you had the ability and then you build like a $200 million house, like 400,000 is close enough to zero compared to the 200 million?
Oh, there's all kinds of games. So it would be an objective number. Is it like objectively according to like expert real estate agent people? Is it so valueless that it's nearly zero? And I don't see that ever happening in California. I mean, maybe, like, let's say they wouldn't even let you park a car. Like, because imagine if you just, one thing that would be super easy to do would to build a non-permanent structure. You could build a coastal coconut shack. And you could have a parking lot. You could invite all your friends to come hang out at your coconut shack. And you could serve drinks. It would all be made out of wood, right? And this would be a business. But it's not a permanent structure, right? It doesn't have cement. It doesn't have a foundation. It doesn't. So if that's all they would let you do, that has value. So it would be an interesting battle whether that would qualify. Like, you want to build a big 2-story McMansion, but all they'll let you build is a wooden structure with no foundation, where you could park, you could put your surfboards and kayaks. I know people that would spend $700,000 for that right to park their cars and their surfboards and their kayaks, who would definitely do that. But anyway, this is the standard. Is that the property worth almost nothing? If it is, it's a regulatory taking. If it only loses half of its value, too bad. It's not a regulatory taking. They don't have to pay. They don't have to pay you market value compensation. That was a good one. I hadn't thought of that one. Regulatory takings. That's kind of a hard one. It's kind of like a, kind of law school kind of issue. Yeah.
So, I suppose if say someone builds a property and then I'm just trying to see if I understand regulatory taking correctly. If essentially like a property is like kind of destroyed and then the environmental rules surrounding that area prevent development, is the state of California has to pay compensation for that?
If they deny them a building permit, they might have to pay compensation if they won't let them build anything. But again, I said might. Again, the circumstances of every instance are a little bit different, and they can affect the outcome depending on what the circumstances are. Another really interesting debate is over, well, what if you have somebody who buys the property right after a new law takes effect that reduces the ability to develop coastal property? So they know about it. Everybody knows about it, but they buy the property anyway, even though they know they can't develop it. Is that still a taking when they get their permit denied? The Supreme Court has said yes, it's still a taking, even if they took the property with notice that they couldn't develop it. according to the Supreme Court. Because there's been lots of these cases that have made it to the Supreme Court. I don't know them all. I just, know generalities. Any other questions or thoughts about anything we talked about? I could definitely get 5 questions out of it. This is plenty for 5 questions. I can't think of anything else. All right, in that case, see you on Wednesday. We'll do another 5-question quiz. There's still a few up here that haven't been picked up from last time. If you have any questions, feel free to, shoot me an email.